August 30th, 1945. Yokohama, Japan. A light drizzle fell upon the war-torn port as the USS John Land approached the dock, carrying the first contingent of American occupation forces to arrive in the defeated empire. Among them stood Sergeant James Washington of the segregated 24th Infantry Regiment, one of the few all-black units deployed to Japan in the immediate aftermath of surrender. As he gazed at the unfamiliar shoreline, Washington believed his unit would face the same hostility they had encountered throughout the Pacific Campaign. Little did he know that the next 12 months would completely transform his understanding of culture, humanity, and his own place in a rapidly changing world. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how Black American soldiers became unexpected cultural ambassadors in post-war Japan, and how their presence helped heal wounds that weapons never could, revealing how genuine human connection can flourish in the most unlikely circumstances. The rain intensified as Sergeant Washington led his squad down the gangplank. At 32, Washington had already lived several lifetimes' worth of experiences. Raised in Tulsa, he had survived the devastating race massacre of 1921 as a child, joined the Army in 41 after Pearl Harbor, and fought his way across multiple Pacific islands while serving a country that still treated him as a second-class citizen. His weathered face carried both the physical and emotional scars of these experiences. "Keep your heads on a swivel, boys," Washington instructed his men. "We don't know what kind of welcome committee these folks have planned." The squad members nodded grimly, tightening their grips on their rifles despite the formal Japanese surrender 2 weeks earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bussey, commanding officer of their battalion, had briefed them extensively before landing. "You men will be representing not just America, but Negro Americans specifically. The Japanese have never seen black folks before except in propaganda. They've been told we're cannibal savages. Your conduct will determine how they see us for generations." As Washington's squad moved through the devastated port area, they encountered their first Japanese civilians, mainly dock workers and a few curious onlookers who kept their distance. The sergeant noticed how they stared, not with the hatred he'd expected, but with unmistakable curiosity and apprehension. "They're scared of us, Sarge," whispered Private First Class Marcus Johnson, the youngest member of the squad at barely 19 years old. "They just lost a war, Johnson. They'd be scared of their own shadows right now," replied Washington, though he sensed something different in these interactions than what he'd experienced in European theaters. Among the Japanese observers stood Akiko Tanaka, a 26-year-old former schoolteacher who had lost her husband at Okinawa. With her aging mother and 5-year-old daughter Yumiko to support, Akiko had taken work as a translator for the municipal government, having studied English before the war. She had been assigned to help coordinate with occupation authorities, but found herself frozen in place as she watched the Black American soldiers disembark. "They're so different from what the newspapers told us," she whispered to her colleague Hiroshi Yamamoto, a middle-aged civil servant. "Remember what we were instructed," Yamamoto cautioned. "Be polite, be distant, give them no reason to enforce harsher occupation terms." The American occupation of Japan was unprecedented in world history, the first foreign takeover of the Japanese home islands in the nation's 600-year recorded history. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, some 430 Jura American personnel would eventually oversee the country's demilitarization and democratization. Among them, approximately 15,000 Izarans Black American soldiers would serve in the occupation, primarily in service and support roles, though some, like Washington's unit, were combat veterans reassigned to security and peacekeeping. Japanese civilians had been prepared for the occupation through a flurry of government directives. The Japanese Cabinet's Board of Information had issued guidelines instructing people to be courteous but distant with occupation forces. Special concern had been raised about encounters with black soldiers, who Japanese propaganda had portrayed as barely human throughout the war. 3 days after landing, Sergeant Washington's squad was assigned to guard a warehouse complex containing food supplies and medical equipment. Their posting was in Yokohama's Yamate district, a neighborhood that had once housed foreign diplomats before the war, but now stood partially destroyed by American bombing raids. Johnson, Rivera, take the north perimeter. Diggs and Peters, you've got the south entrance. Coleman and I will patrol the main building, Washington ordered as they relieved the previous shift. Private Henry Coleman, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh, fell in beside the sergeant as they began their rounds. Still can't get over how these people look at us, Sarge. Back home, white folks either don't see us at all or look at us like we're about to rob them. These Japanese, they stare like we're from the moon. Washington nodded. Different kind of racism, I suppose. They don't know what to make of us. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of movement near one of the storage buildings. Washington raised his hand, signaling for Coleman to stop, then slowly approached with his rifle at the ready. Behind a partially collapsed wall, they discovered a young woman attempting to pry open a crate with a metal bar. She froze when she spotted them, her eyes widening with terror. It was Akiko Tanaka. Driven by desperation to feed her family, she had attempted the unthinkable, stealing from the occupation forces. "Please," she managed in accented English, dropping the bar with a clang that echoed through the empty warehouse. "My daughter, hungry." Washington lowered his weapon slightly but maintained his official posture. "Ma'am, you can't be here. This is restricted property." Akiko bowed deeply, her entire body trembling. "I am very sorry, very sorry. Please, I accept punishment, but my family—" Her voice broke as she struggled to maintain composure. Washington and Coleman exchanged glances. The standard protocol was clear. Detain her for the military police who would likely make an example of her. Theft from occupation forces carried severe penalties designed to discourage any form of resistance. "Coleman, check the perimeter. Make sure she's alone," Cy Washington ordered. Once the private moved away, he approached Akiko cautiously. "How long since you've eaten properly?" he asked, his voice softer. 3 days for me. But I save rice for my daughter and mother," Akiko replied, her eyes downcast. Washington reached into his pack and removed his personal rations, a can of beans, some crackers, and a chocolate bar. He held them out to her. "Take these, then go home. Don't come back here." Akiko stared at the offered food in disbelief. "But why would you help me? I'm enemy." "The war's over, Ma'am, and hungry folks look the same everywhere." This encounter marked the beginning of what would become a complex relationship between Washington's unit and the local Japanese community. Against regulations, Washington began to organize a system where excess rations and damaged goods that would normally be discarded were discreetly channeled to local community leaders for distribution. Captain Robert Williamson, Washington's company commander, discovered the arrangement 2 weeks later. A career officer from Philadelphia with a reputation for strict adherence to regulations, Williamson summoned Washington to his office in a requisitioned former bank building. "Sergeant, I've received reports about unauthorized distribution of supplies to locals from our warehouse," Williamson stated, his voice carefully neutral as he reviewed paperwork on his desk. "Care to explain?" Washington stood at attention. "No excuses, sir. I take full responsibility." Williamson leaned back in his chair, studying the sergeant carefully. "Did I ask for excuses? I asked for an explanation." "These people are starving, sir. Food distribution through official channels isn't reaching everyone. We're disposing of damaged goods anyway." The captain nodded slowly. "You realize this could be considered fraternization, possibly even undermining occupation directives." "Yes, sir, I'm prepared to accept the consequences." To Washington's surprise, Williamson stood and walked to a map of Yokohama pinned to the wall. "How many civilians are you currently assisting?" "About 70 families in the neighborhood adjacent to our position, sir." "And you maintain records of distribution? Ensure fairness?" Washington blinked in confusion. "Yes, sir. Private Johnson keeps detailed logs." "Good," Williamson nodded. "Starting tomorrow, we're formalizing this operation. I'll designate it as a Community Stability Initiative in my reports to Battalion. We'll establish proper accountability and expand if possible. The happier these people are, the less likely they'll cause problems." "Sir?" Washington couldn't hide his surprise. "Washington, I'm a pragmatist. MacArthur's directive is to win the peace after winning the war. Hungry people don't cooperate with occupiers. But," he raised a finger in warning, "this remains under strict military control and documentation. Understood?" Yes, sir, thank you, sir. As Washington turned to leave, Williamson added, "And, Sergeant, your men seem to be generating unusually positive relations with the locals. That's worth noting, given what we were told to expect." Over the following weeks, the Community Stability Initiative expanded beyond food distribution. The warehouses under Washington's unit's protection began serving as informal community centers where local Japanese civilians could receive medical attention, practice English, and eventually participate in cultural exchange activities. Akiko Tanaka, whose initial encounter with Washington could have ended much differently, became a key liaison between the American soldiers and the Japanese community. Her English skills proved invaluable, and her initial fear of the black American soldiers gradually transformed into respect. On October 15, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Bussey visited the Yamate warehouse complex for an inspection tour. Accompanied by Captain Williamson, he observed the operation with a critical eye. "Captain, when I authorized your Community Stability Initiative, I didn't envision quite this level of integration," Bussey remarked as they watched Private Johnson teaching a group of Japanese children how to play baseball in the courtyard. "Results speak for themselves, sir," Williamson replied confidently. "Incidents of theft and vandalism in our area of responsibility are down 78% compared to adjacent sectors. We haven't had a single security breach in 3 weeks." Bussey nodded thoughtfully. "The General Staff is beginning to take notice of the different reception our colored troops are receiving compared to white units. There's some indication that Japanese civilians find our men less threatening." "It's more than that, sir," Williamson ventured. "There seems to be a peculiar kind of mutual understanding developing. Both groups know something about being considered lesser." This observation proved increasingly accurate as the occupation continued. Japanese civilians, initially terrified of the black American soldiers based on wartime propaganda, discovered that these men often treated them with more dignity than many white troops. The black soldiers, accustomed to discrimination in American society, found themselves in the unusual position of representing American authority while simultaneously understanding what it meant to be subjugated. By December 1945, Washington's warehouse complex had become a model for community relations, hosting regular cultural exchange events. During one such gathering, Akiko approached Washington as he supervised the distribution of Christmas candy to local children. "Sergeant Washington, may I ask a personal question?" she inquired hesitantly. "Go ahead, Ms. Tanaka. Why do you help us so much? Your country and mine were bitter enemies. Many Americans treat us with contempt." Washington considered the question carefully before responding. "Back home, there are restaurants I can't eat in, neighborhoods I can't live in, and jobs I can't apply for because of my skin color. I know what it's like to be looked down on. Maybe that's why I can't bring myself to do the same to others, even former enemies." Akiko nodded slowly. "Japanese people are learning many difficult lessons now. Perhaps most important is that our leaders were wrong about many things, including you." As winter settled over occupied Japan, food shortages became increasingly severe. The Japanese economy had collapsed, infrastructure lay in ruins from bombing campaigns, and millions of returning soldiers and displaced civilians strained already limited resources. Official American policy provided minimal relief, focusing on preventing starvation but not addressing the broader humanitarian crisis. In response, Washington's unit expanded their community support efforts, often bending regulations to breaking point. When a shipment of canned goods arrived damaged at their warehouse, rather than following procedure to declare it unfit and destroy it, they organized a distribution network that reached hundreds of families. Private Johnson had developed a particularly close connection with local children, teaching them English through games and songs. Among his regular students was Akiko's daughter Yumiko, who had overcome her initial terror of the towering black soldiers to become a frequent visitor to the warehouse complex. "Sarge, these kids are learning faster than anyone back in Mississippi would believe," Johnson remarked one evening, as they closed the makeshift classroom. "Little Yumiko's already reading basic English." "They're hungry for more than just food," Washington observed. Their whole world got turned upside down. They're trying to understand the new one. Not everyone approved of the close relationships developing between the Black American soldiers and Japanese civilians. Major William Cartwright, a white officer from the military government section, made an unannounced inspection in January 1946 that threatened to end the entire program. "This level of fraternization is entirely inappropriate, Captain Williamson," Cartwright declared after observing the community activities. "These people are a defeated enemy, not summer camp attendees. General MacArthur's directive is clear. We maintain professional distance." "With respect, Major, we've had 0 security incidents in our sector since implementing this approach," Williamson countered. "Cooperation from local authorities is at maximum levels." "That's beside the point," Cartwright insisted, "and I'm particularly concerned about the involvement of your colored troops. There have been uncomfortable reports about the nature of their interactions with Japanese females." Washington, who was present for this discussion, felt a familiar anger rising but maintained his professional demeanor. The implication was clear. The same racist assumptions that followed black men in America were being transferred to the occupation. Williamson stiffened visibly. "Major, I maintain detailed records of all activities in this facility. There has not been a single incident of inappropriate conduct. My men have behaved with exemplary professionalism." "Nevertheless," Cartwright continued, "I'm recommending immediate curtailment of this program and rotation of your security personnel to minimize community contact. The confrontation might have ended the initiative entirely if not for an unexpected intervention." As the officers argued, a delegation of Japanese community leaders arrived for a scheduled meeting, led by Hiroshi Yamamoto and including Akiko as translator. Seeing the tension, Yamamoto inquired through Akiko about the problem. When she explained the situation, Yamamoto requested permission to speak directly to Major Cartwright. "Major, forgive my intrusion," he began formally, with Akiko translating. "But I feel I must inform you of the importance of these American soldiers to our community. Before their arrival, there was great fear. We believed terrible things about these men. Now they have become a symbol of hope and fairness to our people. Their kindness has done more to create peace between our nations than any official policy." Cartwright seemed taken aback by the direct address. "That's noted, Mr. Yamamoto, but occupation policy isn't determined by local preferences." "Of course," Yamamoto continued politely but firmly. "However, I have been asked by our district council to formally request that Sergeant Washington's unit remain in place. We have prepared a petition signed by over 300 family representatives attesting to their positive influence." The Japanese man produced a document covered in signatures and characters, handing it to the surprised major. Such a direct appeal from defeated Japanese citizens was unprecedented. The situation represented a profound irony. Japanese civilians advocating for the continued presence of black American soldiers, while white American leadership sought to limit their community engagement. 3 days later, Captain Williamson received new orders. Rather than terminating the community initiative, it would be expanded as a pilot program under the Civil Information and Education section of the occupation government. Major Cartwright had been overruled by higher authorities who recognized the potential propaganda value of positive Japanese-American interactions. As winter gave way to spring in 1946, the relationship between Washington's unit and the local community continued to evolve. American soldiers participated in the rebuilding of a local school. Japanese residents shared traditional cooking techniques to help the Americans improve their mess hall offerings, and cultural misunderstandings gradually gave way to genuine connections. One of the most significant developments came through music. Private Coleman, who had played saxophone in Pittsburgh jazz clubs before the war, began informal jam sessions with several Japanese musicians who had maintained their instruments throughout the conflict. These sessions attracted growing crowds of both Americans and Japanese, creating a space where communication transcended language barriers. During one such gathering in April, Coleman was performing alongside Takashi Moriyama, a Japanese trumpeter who had once played American jazz in secret during the war years when such enemy music was forbidden. Their rendition of Duke Ellington's Take the A Train had drawn an enthusiastic audience of soldiers and civilians. "Man, you play like you grew up in Harlem," Coleman told Moriyama during a break. "Where'd you learn American jazz?" Through Akiko's translation, Moriyama explained that he had studied recordings smuggled into Japan by international merchants before the war. American music was considered dangerous by the government, he explained. They said it would corrupt Japanese spirit, but to me, it spoke of freedom. Coleman nodded in understanding. "Back home, plenty of clubs where I can play but not sit in the audience. Music's the only place where color sometimes doesn't matter." This exchange captured the essence of the unexpected connections forming between these former enemies. Both groups had experienced oppression, the Japanese now under occupation after their defeat, and Black Americans under the persistent weight of segregation, even while representing their country abroad. As spring progressed, Washington received news that further complicated the situation. His unit would be among the first to welcome Japanese war brides, women who had married American servicemen and were now permitted to immigrate to the United States under the War Brides Act of 1945. While most of these marriages involved white servicemen, a small number of black soldiers had also married Japanese women, creating a new dimension to the cultural exchange. Lieutenant Thomas Jenkins, a black officer assigned to process these cases, consulted with Washington on how to prepare the couples for the reality they would face in America. "These folks have no idea what they're walking into," Jenkins confided as they reviewed paperwork in Washington's office. "Jim Crow's waiting for them back home. Mixed marriages are still illegal in most states." Washington shook his head grimly. "And how do we explain that to people who've seen us here representing American authority and freedom?" The irony wasn't lost on either man. Black soldiers who had been part of liberating and democratizing Japan would return to an America where their own freedom remained severely limited. Their Japanese brides would discover that the country their husbands represented treated those same men as second-class citizens. This contradiction became increasingly apparent to the Japanese civilians who had come to know the Black American soldiers. During a community council meeting in May 1946, Hiroshi Yamamoto raised questions that reflected this growing awareness. "We are told America fights for freedom and equality," he said through Akiko's translation. "Yet we learn that Sergeant Washington cannot vote in some American states. We are told to adopt democracy, while America denies it to some of its own people. How do we understand this?" Captain Williamson, present for the meeting, found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to explain American racial dynamics to people who had only recently been mortal enemies. "America is still working to perfect its ideals, Mr. Yamamoto. The contradiction you've identified is one we're struggling to resolve." Privately, Williamson confessed to Washington afterward, "How do we sell democracy abroad when we don't fully practice it at home? These people are asking questions I can't answer with a straight face." Washington's response was measured, but carried the weight of his lived experience. "Maybe that's the point, sir. Maybe having to explain our contradictions to others is what forces us to finally face them ourselves." As summer approached, Washington received orders that his unit would be rotating back to the United States in July. The news spread quickly through both the American company and the Japanese community, creating an unexpected sense of loss on both sides. During their final weeks in Yokohama, the unit worked to ensure a smooth transition for their replacements, a difficult task given the unique relationship they had established with the local population. Washington worried that all they had built could quickly unravel if the new unit reverted to the more distant approach typical of occupation forces. The Japanese community, for their part, organized a farewell gathering that demonstrated how far relationships had evolved from the tense early days of the occupation. Local families prepared traditional foods, children performed songs they had learned in English, and community leaders presented handmade gifts to the departing soldiers. Akiko Tanaka, whose attempted theft had initiated Washington's involvement with the community, now served as master of ceremonies for the event. Her daughter Yumiko, now 6 years old and conversant in basic English, presented Washington with an origami crane she had folded herself. "Sergeant Washington, teacher say crane is for peace," the little girl explained solemnly. "You bring peace." Washington accepted the delicate paper creation with uncharacteristic emotion. Thank you, Yumiko. I'll keep it to remember you. Later that evening, Akiko approached Washington as the celebration continued around them. My daughter asks if you must really leave, she said. I try to explain rotation, but she does not understand why friends go away. It's hard to understand even for adults, Washington admitted, but your community will be in good hands. Captain Williamson has briefed the incoming unit thoroughly. Akiko nodded, then hesitated before continuing. There is something I wish to say while I have chance. When American ships first arrived, we were told many frightening things about black soldiers. Our officials warned us to stay away, that you were dangerous, different from other Americans. Washington listened silently, all too familiar with such characterizations. But now we understand that you are different, not in ways we were told, but in how you treated us with dignity when you could have shown contempt. You saw us as people when you could have seen only enemies. She bowed deeply. For this lesson, my community will always be grateful. As their deployment neared its end, Washington reflected on the unprecedented experience with Private Coleman as they supervised the inventory of warehouse supplies for handover. Never thought I'd find more respect in a country we just defeated than back in the land I was born, Coleman remarked. Makes you wonder what we're really going back to. We're going back to continue a different kind of fight, Washington replied. One that might be harder than the war we just won. On their final day in Yokohama, Washington's unit formed up in the courtyard of the warehouse complex that had been their home for nearly a year. A crowd of Japanese civilians gathered to watch their departure, an uncommon sight in occupied Japan, where most American unit rotations happened without civilian acknowledgement, much less ceremony. As the soldiers boarded trucks that would transport them to the port, small groups of Japanese children ran alongside, waving and calling out the English phrases they had learned. Among them was Yumiko, clutching her mother's hand and calling, "Goodbye, Sergeant Washington, goodbye!" Washington raised his hand in a final salute, not to the flag or his superior officers, but to the unlikely community that had formed in the aftermath of history's deadliest conflict. In that moment, standing between two worlds, he understood that the true measure of victory wasn't in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the human connections forged across seemingly impossible divides. The wheels of history continued turning as Sergeant Washington's unit departed Japan in July 1946. Their replacement, a company from the 25th Infantry Regiment, another all-black unit, arrived with skepticism about the unusually positive relationship described in the handover briefings. Few American units had experienced anything but cautious formality from the Japanese civilians they encountered during the occupation. Lieutenant Samuel Harrison, the new detachment commander, reviewed Captain Williamson's detailed records with open disbelief. "You're telling me these people actually requested to keep your unit stationed here, after everything that happened during the war?" "The documents speak for themselves, Lieutenant," Williamson replied, gesturing to the petition from the Japanese Community Council. "It wasn't about forgetting the war, it was about finding a way forward." Harrison shook his head. "Well, we'll see if they're still so friendly when they realize we're not bending regulations to feed the neighborhood." Williamson fixed the younger officer with a steady gaze. "Lieutenant, this operation reduced security incidents by over 80% and became a model that's being replicated in 3 other sectors. I strongly recommend you consider continuing the community engagement protocols." The transition proved more challenging than either officer anticipated. Despite Harrison's initial resistance, he quickly discovered that the Japanese community had grown accustomed to a certain type of relationship with the American forces stationed in their neighborhood. Their expectations had been fundamentally transformed by Washington's approach. 3 weeks after taking command, Harrison found himself facing Hiroshi Yamamoto and a delegation from the Community Council in his office, with Akiko Tanaka still serving as translator. The meeting had been requested to address growing tensions since the unit rotation. "We understand new policies, Lieutenant," Yamamoto began formally through Akiko's translation, "but previous arrangement brought stability to both sides. May we discuss possibility of resuming community coordination meetings?" Harrison had spent his first weeks tightening security and reducing civilian access to the warehouse complex, convinced that his predecessors had grown too lax. The result had been a sharp increase in petty theft attempts and a noticeable cooling in community cooperation. Mr. Yamamoto, I appreciate your interest, but we're operating under standard occupation protocols now, Harrison responded stiffly. The previous unit's arrangements were unorthodox. Akiko translated, then added on her own behalf, Lieutenant, if I may speak freely, the previous arrangement was not merely about distribution of goods. It created trust. When there is trust, there are fewer problems for everyone. Harrison studied the Japanese woman carefully. According to the records, she had initially been caught attempting to steal supplies, yet she had become a key liaison between the American forces and the local community. This contradiction intrigued him. Ms. Tanaka, why did the previous arrangement work when, by all accounts, it should have failed? Japanese civilians have every reason to resent American forces, particularly. He hesitated, then continued, particularly soldiers who might remind them of wartime propaganda. Akiko considered the question before responding. Because Sergeant Washington and his men did not treat us as defeated enemy, but as people who had been misled by our leaders. They showed respect when they could have shown power. This changed how we saw them. The conversation left Harrison thoughtful. Over the following days, he reviewed intelligence reports showing that areas with more engaged community relations indeed showed lower rates of black market activity, sabotage, and resistance to occupation directives. By mid-August 1946, Harrison made a decision that would ultimately validate Washington's approach. He reinstated modified versions of the community programs, albeit with stricter oversight and documentation. Civilian access to the warehouse complex resumed for English lessons, medical assistance, and cultural exchange events. Sergeant Marcus Wilson, Harrison's operations NCO, initially questioned the reversal. "Thought you said this was going to be a tight ship, Lieutenant." "It still is, Sergeant," Harrison replied, "but sometimes effectiveness matters more than orthodoxy. The numbers don't lie. This approach works. And frankly, these people seem more willing to accept direction from us than from some white units I've observed." Wilson nodded slowly. "Word is getting around among our boys stationed elsewhere. Apparently, Japanese civilians treat colored troops differently. Less fear, more curiosity." This observation aligned with broader patterns emerging throughout occupied Japan. Reports from military intelligence indicated that black American soldiers often encountered less hostility than their white counterparts, despite imperial Japanese propaganda that had portrayed black Americans as subhuman during the war years. A classified study commissioned by General MacArthur's headquarters in September 1946 attempted to analyze this unexpected development. The report, titled Comparative Civilian Response to Occupation Personnel, documented that incidents of civilian resistance were 37% lower in areas primarily patrolled by black units compared to those with predominantly white personnel. One passage in the report offered a theory. Japanese civilians appear to distinguish between white American forces, whom they associate directly with their defeat and the devastation of their cities, and Negro troops, whom they perceive as somehow separate from American power structures. This misperception may be inadvertently beneficial to occupation objectives. What the report failed to acknowledge was that this misperception contained a kernel of truth. Black American soldiers, themselves subject to discrimination within their own country and military, often approached their occupation duties with a different perspective than many of their white counterparts. By autumn 1946, Lieutenant Harrison had fully embraced the community engagement strategy pioneered by Washington's unit. Under his leadership, the warehouse complex expanded its services to include vocational training programs, where Japanese civilians learned skills useful for rebuilding efforts, while American soldiers received instruction in Japanese language and customs. Akiko Tanaka continued her role as a primary liaison, her initial crime long forgotten, as she became indispensable to the success of the program. During one coordination meeting, Harrison asked about her background. "I was a teacher before the war," she explained. "I studied English literature at Women's College in Tokyo. My husband was university professor of history before being drafted. He died at Okinawa." "I'm sorry," Harrison offered, the formality between them momentarily dissolving. "Many losses on both sides," Akiko acknowledged simply. Now we must think of future. My daughter needs peaceful world. As the occupation entered its second year, the successful community relations model established in Yokohama attracted attention from higher authorities. In November 1946, Colonel James Thompson from MacArthur's headquarters visited to assess the program firsthand. "Impressive operation, Lieutenant," Thompson remarked as Harrison guided him through the compound, where Japanese civilians were engaged in various activities alongside American personnel. "Particularly how you've managed to maintain security while fostering cooperation." "Thank you, sir. Though I can't take credit for the original concept, that belongs to my predecessors." Thompson nodded. "Yes, I've reviewed those reports. Tell me, do you have any insight into why these Japanese civilians seem so comfortable with your men? It runs counter to everything intelligence predicted about how they'd respond to Negro troops." Harrison had given this considerable thought over the previous months. "Permission to speak frankly, sir. Please, I believe there's a shared experience of being underestimated, sir. The Japanese have been defeated, their worldview shattered. They're being told their entire belief system was wrong. My men know something about having to navigate a world where others define your place and worth." Thompson's expression remained neutral, but he made a note in his small leather-bound notebook. "Interesting perspective, Lieutenant. Continue with the tour." The Colonel's visit resulted in additional resources being allocated to expand the program. By December 1946, similar community engagement initiatives had been established in 12 locations throughout occupied Japan, 9 of them overseen by black units. As 1947 began, a new development further complicated the dynamics of the occupation. American authorities, concerned about the spread of communism in post-war Asia, began relaxing some restrictions on Japanese society and accelerating reconstruction efforts. This shift in policy created new opportunities for cooperation between occupation forces and local communities. In February, Sergeant Washington, now stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, received an unexpected letter that had traveled halfway around the world. It was from Akiko Tanaka, written in careful English. "Dear Sergeant Washington, I hope this letter finds you well in America. Our community still remembers your kindness. The new American soldiers continue your work, though differently. Lieutenant Harrison is learning our ways, as we learn yours. My daughter Yumiko asks about you often. She keeps a photograph of your squad and her with the baseball you gave her. She wants to visit America someday to see Sergeant Washington's country. There is much rebuilding happening now. Many buildings rise where there was destruction. Perhaps nations can rebuild like cities, with respect and gratitude. Akiko Tanaka." Washington read the letter several times, struck by the distance, both geographic and experiential, between his current reality and the unusual community that had formed in Yokohama. Back in Georgia, he had returned to the familiar constraints of American segregation, his uniform no shield against the discrimination that defined daily life. He penned a reply that evening, describing his new assignment training recruits, while carefully omitting details about the restrictions he faced off-base. He enclosed a small package containing candy for Yumiko and English language books for Akiko's translation work. This correspondence would continue for years, becoming an important connection between two worlds that had briefly overlapped during the early occupation period. Through their letters, Washington and Akiko documented the parallel transformations occurring in both Japan and America as the post-war era unfolded. By mid-1947, the community program in Yokohama had evolved significantly under Lieutenant Harrison's direction. What had begun as an ad hoc humanitarian initiative now operated as a formal civil affairs operation with dedicated funding and personnel. The warehouse complex had been officially redesignated as the Yamate Community Center, serving as both a security installation and a focal point for Japanese-American cooperation. Harrison, whose initial skepticism had given way to committed advocacy for the program, received orders in July 1947 that he would be rotating back to the United States. During his final week in command, he conducted an assessment with Hiroshi Yamamoto and the Community Council. "We have compiled statistics as requested, Lieutenant. Yamamoto reported through an official interpreter who had replaced Akiko in formal meetings, though she remained involved in daily operations. Participation in center activities has increased 43% over the past 6 months. Reported crimes in surrounding neighborhood have decreased 62% compared to adjacent districts. Harrison nodded appreciatively. And community sentiment toward occupation forces. Regular surveys indicate 78% positive rating in this district, compared to 31% average across Yokohama, Yamamoto replied, though I must note that these numbers reflect attitudes specifically toward your unit, not all American forces. This distinction remained a critical factor in the ongoing occupation. Black American units consistently received higher cooperation ratings from Japanese civilians, creating a counterintuitive situation where soldiers who faced discrimination within their own military often proved most effective as representatives of American authority abroad. Colonel Thompson, who had become a proponent of the community engagement approach after his earlier visit, returned to Yokohama in August 1947 to oversee the transition to a new commanding officer. During a private conversation with Harrison before his departure, Thompson raised questions that reflected the Army's growing awareness of this pattern. We're seeing similar results across multiple sectors, Lieutenant. Negro units establishing more effective civilian relations than their white counterparts. It's creating some awkward conversations at headquarters. Harrison maintained his professional demeanor. Awkward in what way, sir? Think about the implications, Harrison. If we acknowledge that these units are more effective in certain occupation functions, we're undermining the entire justification for military segregation. Thompson shook his head. Some senior officers find that conclusion unpalatable. The colonel's observation highlighted a fundamental contradiction in American policy. While fighting a war supposedly for democracy and freedom, the U.S. military remained rigidly segregated. Now, evidence from the occupation suggested that this segregation might actually be hampering effectiveness. As the occupation progressed into its 3rd year, the dynamics of Black American soldiers in Japan contributed to larger discussions about military segregation back in the United States. Reports from occupation authorities, including data from the Yokohama program and similar initiatives, became part of the evidence presented to the Fahy Committee, established by President Truman in 1948, to examine racial inequality in the armed forces. In Yokohama, the community center continued operations under new leadership, maintaining the model established by Washington and refined by Harrison. By 1949, the center was primarily staffed by Japanese personnel with American advisors, a transition that reflected the broader shift in occupation policy toward Japanese self-governance. Akiko Tanaka, whose chance encounter with Sergeant Washington had helped initiate the entire program, eventually became the center's Japanese director in 1950. Under her leadership, the facility evolved from an occupation installation into a genuine community institution that survived the end of the American presence. On April 28, 1952, the San Francisco Peace Treaty took effect, officially ending the Allied occupation of Japan. As American forces prepared for their final withdrawal from Yokohama, a ceremony was held at the community center that had begun as a guarded warehouse 7 years earlier. Among the invited guests was Master Sergeant James Washington, who had requested special leave to attend the event. Now stationed in Europe with one of the Army's newly integrated units, following President Truman's 1948 Executive Order 9981, Washington had maintained his correspondence with Akiko throughout the intervening years. The ceremony featured speeches by Japanese and American officials celebrating the transition from occupation to alliance. When Washington was invited to speak, he kept his remarks brief but pointed. 7 years ago, I arrived here as part of an occupying force, facing people who had every reason to see me as an enemy, he told the assembled crowd. Today I stand here among friends, among people who taught me as much as I ever taught them. If two groups with such reasons for hatred can find common ground, perhaps there's hope for all of us yet. After the official ceremony, Washington reunited with Akiko and her daughter Yumiko, now 12 years old and fluent in English. The girl he remembered as a hungry, frightened child had grown into a confident young student who dreamed of becoming a diplomat. "Sergeant Washington, I kept all your letters," Yumiko told him excitedly. "My teacher uses them to show how Americans write. Everyone is very impressed that I know a real American soldier." Washington smiled at her enthusiasm. "And I've kept all of yours. My wife says your English is better than some people back home." Akiko, who had followed Washington's life through their correspondence, including his marriage to a nurse he had met after returning to the States, regarded him thoughtfully. "You once told me that in America there were places you could not go because of your skin. Has this changed?" Washington's expression grew more complex. "Some things are changing slowly. President Truman integrated the military. The courts are hearing cases about school segregation, but we have a long journey ahead." "As do we," Akiko acknowledged. "Japan must rebuild not just buildings, but our understanding of ourselves in the world. This takes time." During his week-long visit to Yokohama, Washington was struck by the profound transformation of the city he had first encountered in ruins. New buildings stood where rubble had been, businesses thrived, and the visible scars of war were gradually fading. Yet beneath this physical reconstruction, deeper changes had occurred in how former enemies perceived each other. Before departing, Washington visited the community center one final time. The building that had once housed military supplies now contained classrooms, a library with Japanese and English materials, medical facilities, and community meeting spaces. A photo display near the entrance documented its evolution from a military installation to a community institution. Among the photographs was one showing Washington's original squad with a group of Japanese children, including a tiny Yumiko clutching a baseball. Below it, a plaque in Japanese and English read, "From understanding comes peace." As Washington studied the display, an elderly Japanese man approached him, bowing slightly in greeting. It took Washington a moment to recognize Hiroshi Yamamoto, now retired from his government position, but still active in community affairs. "Sergeant Washington," Yamamoto said in halting English he had learned over the years, "good to see you again." "Mr. Yamamoto," Washington acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Your English has improved. Small progress, many years," Yamamoto smiled. "Like peace between nations. Small steps, long time." The two men, once positioned as victor and vanquished, walked together through the center that stood as testament to what could be accomplished when humanity was recognized across the divisions of war, race, and national identity. On his final evening in Japan, Washington was honored at a community dinner where many local residents shared stories about the early days of the occupation and the unexpected bonds that had formed. Several speakers noted how their perceptions had been transformed by their interactions with the Black American soldiers who had first staffed the center. An elderly woman who had received medical treatment from the unit's corpsman in 1945 expressed this transformation directly. "We were told Americans were devils and Black Americans worse than devils, but these men showed us more humanity than our own leaders who sent our sons to die. This was a lesson I never expected to learn from defeat." As Washington prepared to return to his unit in Europe, Akiko presented him with a book containing messages and artwork from community members who had been involved with the center over the years. The inscription on the first page read, "To those who taught us that humanity transcends victory and defeat." This sentiment captured the essence of what had occurred in Yokohama, a recognition on both sides that genuine human connection could emerge from the ashes of conflict. For the Japanese civilians who had endured defeat and occupation, their interactions with Black American soldiers had provided an unexpected window into American society's contradictions. For the soldiers themselves, their service in Japan had offered a rare experience of respect and authority often denied them at home. The story of the Yokohama Community Center remained largely unheralded in official histories of the occupation, yet its impact rippled through the lives of all involved, contributing in small but significant ways to the transformation of both Japanese and American societies in the post-war era. Years later, in 1963, as Washington watched news coverage of civil rights demonstrations sweeping across America, he received a letter from Yumiko Tanaka, now a university student in Tokyo studying international relations. She had been following the American civil rights movement with great interest, recognizing connections to her own childhood experiences. "I remember how you and your soldiers were treated differently by my people than other Americans," she wrote. "Only later did I understand why, because you understood what it meant to be judged unfairly. Now I see your country struggling with this same question." Perhaps Japan's greatest lesson from defeat was learning to see the humanity in those we were taught to fear. "I hope America can learn this lesson without war." Her words reflected the complex legacy of those early occupation years, how unexpected connections formed across lines of race, nationality, and recent enmity had created spaces for mutual recognition and respect. The community center in Yokohama stood as physical proof that alternatives to hatred and fear existed, even in the aftermath of history's most destructive conflict. The lessons learned in Yokohama and similar settings throughout occupied Japan eventually informed broader policy changes. By the time American forces returned to Japan in large numbers during the Korean War, military units were integrated, and occupation experiences had reshaped training and preparation for cross-cultural encounters. For Sergeant James Washington and the men who served with him, their time in Japan represented a unique intersection of military service, racial identity, and cultural diplomacy. They had arrived as representatives of a victorious but deeply flawed democracy and found themselves in the unexpected position of embodying its highest ideals rather than its contradictions. The legacy of their service extended far beyond the physical reconstruction of post-war Japan. In their daily interactions with Japanese civilians, these soldiers helped build bridges of understanding that would support decades of Japanese-American cooperation. More subtly, their experiences contributed to the growing recognition within American society that racial segregation contradicted the very principles for which the war had supposedly been fought. When the Japanese-American Security Treaty was signed in 1960, formally establishing the defense relationship that continues to this day, few remembered the role that Black American soldiers had played in the earliest days of that partnership. Yet in communities like Yokohama, the memory lived on in institutions like the community center and in the lives of those who had experienced firsthand how humanity could prevail over hatred. In 1975, on the 30th anniversary of Japan's surrender, an elderly James Washington received an invitation to return to Yokohama as an honored guest. The community center he had helped establish had been rebuilt and expanded, now serving as both a cultural exchange facility and a museum documenting Japanese-American relations. During the commemoration ceremony, Washington listened as Akiko Tanaka, now in her 70s but still active in community affairs, addressed the gathering. 30 years ago, our nations were enemies. Today we are partners. This change began not with treaties signed by officials, but with small acts of kindness between ordinary people who chose to see each other as human beings first. Her words captured the essence of what had occurred during those pivotal early occupation years, how unexpected connections across lines of race, nationality, and recent enmity had created space for reconciliation and growth. The warehouse complex in Yokohama, transformed from a military installation to a community institution, stood as physical proof that alternatives to hatred existed, even in the aftermath of history's most destructive conflict. As Washington gazed around the room at the gathered Japanese and American officials, he reflected on how far both nations had come since that rainy August day in 1945, when he first set foot on Japanese soil. The journey from enemies to allies had been neither simple nor perfect, but it had been possible. And that possibility offered hope for a world still struggling to overcome its divisions. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.